You're listening to IOE Insights, the UCL Institute of Education podcast at University College London.
Hello, and welcome to the Lived Experience of Dyscalculia podcast series. This has been created as part of our Higher Education Innovation Fund research project at the UCL Institute of Education. And the podcast was created in partnership with the Dyscalculia Network. I'm Liz Herbert.
And I'm Helen Williams. I'm a researcher at the Institute of Education.
So, through in-depth conversations with adults with lived experience of dyscalculia, we've been exploring how this often misunderstood specific learning difficulty shapes everyday life, education, emotions, and the opportunities. And in this podcast series, we share the voices and the insights of people whose experiences are too rarely heard, with the aim of raising awareness, challenging misconceptions, and better informing support for adults with dyscalculia. Just a reminder that adults with dyscalculia remain significantly underrepresented in research, in higher education policy, and in workplace inclusion strategies. And as dyscalculia persists across the lifespan, understanding adult experiences is essential for developing equitable educational provision across the lifespan and informing inclusive workplace practice. So, this is our third and final episode. So, we're going to turn to look today at the identification of dyscalculia. And in particular, here, we're going to look at the impact it has on education. So, this is an area where many of our research participants describe they had really significant difficulties. So, from their early struggles in the classroom to placement in lower sets when they were in school, to the impact of teaching strategies and the impacts of delayed diagnosis. Many of our participants had to wait a very long time to get a diagnosis. And participants often reflected on how this late diagnosis shaped their confidence and their long-term relationship with mathematics. So today we're really lucky and I'm very excited to tell you we're joined here by Pete today. We've got apologies from Amelia who was going to join us, but Pete has joined us all the way from Turkey. So I'm going to say hi, Pete. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good, thanks.
I bet it's sunnier there than it is here.
It is, yeah. But no, I'm doing well. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, just tell us a little bit about, before we launch into some questions that Helen's going to ask you, just tell me a little bit about what you're doing over in Turkey and about you, who you are, why you're here today. I know you're part of the Dyscalculia Network Advisory Board. Is that right, Pete?
That's right, yeah. I'm actually chair of the Adults with Dyscalculia Advisory Board in the Dyscalculia Network, which, as you all know, is a community interest company that volunteers like myself do some volunteer work to raise awareness of dyscalculia and the way that it can affect your everyday life. I guess I should, introduce myself a little bit. So I'm 38 years old. I'm currently working as assistant director at the British Institute at Ankara, which is a research institute based in Turkey where we support research on arts, humanities, and social sciences. And yeah, I mean, as will come out in this podcast, this talk, I'm someone who's always had quite strong skills when it's come to literacy and languages. And on the reverse, though, I've actually struggled quite a lot with maths and still do. And I was diagnosed with dyscalculia when I was about 10 years old. We often say dyscalculia comes with a friend. And my friend, as it were, is dyspraxia. I wouldn't be surprised if there's other things in there as well. But yeah, so for me, a lot of issues with maths. I sort of issues sometimes with coordination, things like that as well.
Yeah, that's a very common co-occurring difficulty. And some of our participants in the prior podcast talked about, for instance, having ADHD as well as dyscalculia. So it's, yeah, as you say, nice that it comes with a friend. So I'm going to pass over to Helen now. So Helen's got a few questions that are based on our recent research.
Thanks very much, Liz. And hi, Pete, again. You mentioned in that introduction to yourself that you were about 10 years old when you got a diagnosis of dyscalculia. Can you tell us when you first started noticing difficulties with mathematics, or when your parents first started noticing difficulties?
So as I mentioned before, I've always had quite strong skills when it's come to things on to languages and literacy, and I'm very fortunate that I always used to score sort of top of the class when it came to English. And so I scored towards the bottom of the class, and in fact, quite considerably at the bottom when it came to maths. And again, I'm fortunate in that my mum is actually a primary school teacher. So I think she was far more attuned to things that could be wrong, things something was up. And she could sense that there was a reason, it wasn't just being a little bit bad at maths. There was something a bit more serious going on. And I'd say sort of anecdotally, and I do find this interesting. I mean, there's so much we don't know about dyscalculia, but it seems to be quite a strong trait in our family. So I have an uncle who's sadly no longer with us, but he was also very strong at literacy, but struggled with maths. And we found some school reports of his where, it's quite upsetting because it seems that these were the years when he used to give, the cane to children, and he get that for maths because they used to think he was not, that how could he be doing so strongly in one subject but not in another? So I do think there's an element of, there's almost something, genealogical there that does seem to be in the family. But yeah, I mean, that's really why I got noticed. And indeed, I then got a statement from an educational psychologist. And that's when it sort of came out that this was just before I went to secondary school. I got a report actually on it. And it said then, yeah, that I came out strongly as having dyscalculia, some traits, obviously also with dyspraxia, but then gifted in other areas. So, yeah.
Yes. So, Pete, what you were saying is that you got a statement. For our listeners who don't know what a statement is, it's kind of been superseded now by the term education, EHCP, Education and Healthcare Plan. And this is would currently be the term used. And I'm thinking when you got, when you were assessed, and I know I'd been around in education for a long time, as has Helen, was this done by an educational psychologist that was attached to the school, or I don't know if you remember.
Yeah, it was. I do remember actually. So it was an educational psychologist. I remember going to an office for it. It was funny because, as this conversation will come out, for a long time, I didn't really engage with my dyscalculia at all. I actually saw it as a bit of a thing to be ashamed of. But a few years ago, I sort of went on a journey, if you like, of sort of coming to terms with it more and looking into it. And I actually found, well, this inverted commas statement. And what was written in it, I mean, it made me laugh because essentially it was saying that I was constantly trying to distract from the maths questions. So when I was talking about books I'd read, films I liked, and then started reeling off facts about different countries and things, and I was trying to distract constantly.
Good tactics, Pete.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So can I just pick up on that, Pete? You mentioned that it was a psychologist, an educational psychologist that gave you that statement. Was it something that your parents pursued privately, or was it something that came through the school? The reason I'm asking is because, again, this has been a recurring theme, is that lots of people have had to pursue this privately because it hasn't been able to be affordable through the school system.
Absolutely. Frustratingly, I can't really give you an answer to that. I think it was probably privately, but, my mum or dad would know. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I just want to also just pick up that I'm very aware of the fact that I was actually very lucky to get that diagnosis, and I know it's really not very common at all. And, as I said before, I initially felt quite ashamed of having dyscalculia, and it's something I tried to hide a lot. But in retrospect, I realized having that diagnosis was extremely important because I think I would have had a worse experience if I hadn't.
Okay, so that leads really nicely into your experiences then at secondary school. So you had this diagnosis and you had a statement of special educational needs which went with you to your secondary school. What impact do you think that had on your education at secondary school?
Major, to be honest. So, I mean, I, in terms of the education I got, so I had a special maths class. So initially I was put in the bottom set for maths, and and eventually I was then taken out into the special educational needs centre, as it was called then. I used to actually have, so two of my lessons a week were with a special maths teacher, sort of a maths teacher that was sort of trained to support people with learning difficulties. And then she used to set work that I would then do with a teaching assistant. And I mean, that really did help. I didn't pass my maths GCSE, which is still sometimes an issue that affects my self-esteem. But I did at least manage to, I got an E, so it wasn't an S, it was an E in the end. And yeah, and so that helped a lot. In terms of culturally in the school, though, I didn't feel, I didn't feel comfortable at all. I found it quite embarrassing that I used to go off special educational needs centre. As I said before, my skills in other areas were strong. So, for example, English, maths, and science were in sets in my school. And so in science, I was a kind of middle set. And I think that was because of the maths element in a lot of science. English, I was in the top, and I used to get the English prize most years. But then maths, yeah, obviously I was going off to special educational needs centre. And as a consequence, with the friends I made, they tend to be sort of high achievers. And so I used to feel quite embarrassed and ashamed. I also went to an all boys school. So it was a comprehensive school, it wasn't a private school, but it was an all boys school. And I have to say, that wasn't the best environment for me, because the school itself had sort of the kind of ethos, the way it represented itself was a school, a sort of science technology kind of place. And there was this kind of culture and this logic in the school that, if you were, men are good at maths, boys are good at maths. And, and in response, English was therefore kind of seen as a bit sort of effeminate, as it were. And so it did lead to teasing. It did lead to, really, to be honest, I mean, I went on to do postgraduate research and I did my PhD on masculinities, literary representations of masculinities. And I always think the seeds of that come from that experience. So for me, I think, maths, it's a whole question about gender as well that I think is connected to it all. And I did find it very, very difficult for sure.
Gosh, there's such a lot there to unpick. I'm just going to pick up on the gender issue, as that's the last thing that you've mentioned there, because we found that there were very few males in our research. So we've interviewed children and young people as well as adults, and actually males are hugely underrepresented. So I'm just interested in what your thoughts are as to why that might be.
Well, I mean, I don't think for a minute that, it's that, there aren't many men out there that are also have dyscalculia. There definitely are. I mean, the uncle I mentioned even earlier, I mean, obviously a man. So, and I mean, obviously he didn't have a diagnosis, but I would guess that was the case. But I think there's there's a lot in sort of masculinity and sort of being man, which is often about putting up a front and not admitting kind of weaknesses or areas that you find challenging or need support on. And I do think our approach to education is extremely gendered. I really do. And I do think, maths, particularly because I think of the traits we often associate with kind of masculinities, it's often about logic. It's about, taking emotion out of it. It's about being sort of scientific or what have you. And I think as a consequence, we sort of, as a society, sort of imagine men to be good at maths, or this is a kind of masculinized sort of subject. So I think that is a big reason. And I would love to see more research on that. I think it's important. I think that is a big reason why you probably won't find more men coming forward and saying, actually, I find maths really difficult. And I think, even just in the sort of households as well. I mean, if you think about the way that we gender how we look after bills and budgets. There's a yeah, I mean, equally for women as well, this is problematic. But I do think we see that, oh, that's sort of like, the man's job kind of thing. I mean, it's obviously, I'm not saying I support that, I agree with it. But I think that also leads to that kind of cultural baggage, gendered cultural baggage when it comes to maths.
And and Pete, it does. I think actually the research, a lot of the research on dyscalculia does suggest that there isn't actually a significant gender divide in the prevalence. And I think there've been some large scale evaluations of school children, and the ratio tends to be pretty even between boys and girls. So prevalence wise, so that's quite interesting, isn't it? That the interviews that we did were mainly with women and girls.
So it's possible, I guess, Liz, is that people just weren't pushing themselves forward because of this not wanting to admit that there's actually an issue. So, yes, you're right, Pete. I think we do need to do more research. And I think this is the beginning of something rather than the end point here. I'm just going to pick you up on something you mentioned in your earlier response about the emotions that you felt. And you said you felt a sense of shame and about being stigmatized, I guess, by being in the bottom set and having to go to the special classes. And you talked about being teased at school. So tell me a little bit more about your sort of emotional journey over your secondary school period, and how did you overcome it? Because you clearly did. You're very successful now.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, yeah, I mean, to begin with, I really struggled. I didn't like to admit the fact that I had dyscalculia or I had issues with maths. Of course, we have a problem, even that's still the case now, where people don't really know what that word means, let alone how to pronounce it and what have you. So that also, it tends to lead to more questions than answers. And I mean, even if you look on social media now, I mean, I know there's a lot of nastiness on social media, full stop, but if you look at people posting about dyscalculia, you'll always find posted something underneath about, oh, they're just making up another issue now. And I mean, there are also nasty people that deny the existence of dyslexia, of course, but it always seems to me crazy that people don't seem to have thought, well, if dyslexia exists, surely there's something similar for numeracy, because me, that's just fierce, but we haven't. But anyway, that's a slightly side.
Oh, sorry, Pete. I was just going to come in there and say it's interesting actually that with dyslexia we had the big Delphi study, didn't we? When with regards to the new UK definition done by Julia Carroll and her colleagues, where well we have got a new definition of dyscalculia in the UK, which is the 2025 one. There wasn't a Delphi study preceding that, so interesting, isn't it? That yeah, again, there's a disparity.
Oh, a very big one. I mean, as a dyscalculia network, they always talk about how actually dyslexia is around 20 years behind. Sorry, dyscalculia is about 20 years behind dyslexia in terms of research and awareness. I mean, certainly this awareness, I would say, maybe even more than 20. But to come back to the sort of original question about sort of emotions and feelings, yeah, it definitely wasn't positive. I mean, particularly when you're a teenager, it's often the case, you don't like to appear different in any way. You like to, I mean, as we get older, we realize actually, what makes you different is cool. That's what makes you you. But when you're a teenager, you don't feel like that at all. You just want to fit in. And so I found it really very, very difficult. I would purposely be late sometimes because I didn't want people to see me going in there, lie about where I was going at maths class. I remember at one point saying I was so gifted at maths, I had to go for these special classes. I mean, there's all sorts. I really felt, embarrassed by it. And it did continue, even into my undergraduate degree, because I remember at one point, so I declared obviously my dyscalculia when I was going to university. And, the university put in a sort of education plan. And of course, dyscalculia and dyspraxia don't just affect maths. They can also affect all of this kind of stuff. So I was given extra time for exams, but I remember very well I was taken off. I was taken off into another classroom, and I was furious. I really didn't like it because really didn't like the fact that I was seen to be different. And of course, then you get questions afterwards, like, "Oh, what happened? Why were you taken to a different classroom?" Or even like, why aren't you in the exam hall?" So all of these kinds of feelings of shame, this was really, really where it was all of it really. It really did impact me a lot. And, to be honest as well, when I actually started really coming to terms with my dyscalculia, it's when I was in my early 30s. And I, you know, I've been successful in my career and things like that. But during COVID, I hit, as many people do, I hit a difficult patch, and I became aware, or I thought maybe I need to retrain. And I had thought, because I'd done a lot of teaching English in my career and a lot of teaching, although not in schools, but more kind of higher education and teaching English as a foreign language. And so I thought, well, maybe I should do a PGCE and retrain as an English teacher. And I found, despite all of my achievements, I couldn't get on because I hadn't passed my maths GCSE. And, initially, I can tell you now, I mean, I'm in a much better sort of mental state and everything now, because now it just makes me angry because I do think it is actually discrimination. But when I was in a point when, I couldn't find a job, and I just felt really upset, and I sort of turned a lot of that, inwards, and I felt like a failure. And I started trying to do a maths GCSE in adult education centres. And I tried two different courses. The first one I turned up, they didn't know what dyscalculia was. And the second course I turned up to, the teacher was lovely, actually, really nice person. But I remember there were so many people in that class that needed help. And incidentally, you would not believe how many of them were trying to be teachers, and they had degrees from very good universities in the UK, but they just wanted to be teachers in English, in art, in history, in things like this. And again, it's this blimmin' maths GCSE that they couldn't pass. And one person told me that this was their third time doing it. And I do feel, does, when I reflect on it, I do get angry, because I think these people are, we sort of talk about unemployment issues and things like that in the UK. Well, there is a prime example. People that will be excellent teachers that are being vented because of this, and that is just wrong, wrong, wrong. Uh, and I do. So anyway, I went for this. I tried to do maths GCSE again. It caused me a huge amount of stress. I mean, I also suffer from psoriasis, which I actually, to be honest, I developed around the time I was in secondary school. So it's probably also linked. And I was getting horrendous psoriasis flare ups. And I just felt sick every time I was going to the maths class. And then I actually just put a Facebook message out one day, because I was just looking for an answer or for some help. Because the maths homework, I was sitting down and doing it, and I can't retain maths facts. It was just hopeless. I just could not. I mean, I really could not do it. Like, it was just the point that it was taking me so much energy, and I just was looking at it, and I was thinking, I don't know how to even begin answering this maths question. And I put a message on Facebook on a dyscalculia group I found, and I just asked, does anyone else have this? And an absolute angel called Cat Eagle answered that message. And that's how I got involved in this Dyscalculia network. And being involved, Kat, I do have to say, Kat is a absolutely wonderful person. And she's an absolute, she's worth more than her body weight in gold. And she really gave me the confidence, actually, to say, look, I don't actually say, she said, you can't, I'm not saying you can't do a maths GCSE, you can, but you can't do it in a year. You need more time, you need the space. And she really empowered me to the point where I am, where I think, yes, I would do a maths GCSE. I would love to I'd see that as a bigger achievement than my PhD, to be honest. But I want to do it on my own terms, and I don't want to do it to please other people. I want to do it to please myself and to show that I don't know. And being involved in this Calculator network, more than helping me sort of come to terms with my dyscalculia, it also helped me sort of come to terms with who I am and help me realize that there's actually a lot that I can do, and there's a lot that I can achieve, and that it doesn't have to be measured by whether I've got a C in maths or not.
Gosh, oh, that's so empowering to hear you talk, there, Pete. It really is. That's super. That the fact that you've managed to use the difficulties that you've had to kind of go through it the other side. It is fantastic. I just wonder. Lots of our participants in our research noted about some teaching strategies being more helpful to them than others. And just thinking about some of the things you said, you said you found things like number facts really hard to retain. And I just wonder if there are some teaching strategies that you have found, or some sort of mnemonics that have been more useful to you than others, just thinking about other people that may also have difficulties. What advice might you suggest?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a huge fan of calculators. I don't feel there should be any shame in calculators. I also can't. I mean, for me, I'm very, I learn by writing things out. So for me, I often need to write out. So I sort of sketch out if I've got to do a sum or whatever. I have to sort of write it out, and I will draw, like a bunny hops or whatever between numbers. I also use fingers a lot, and I can't really sort of calculate without my fingers. So these sorts of things have helped me. I do find if it's something to do. So in my job, for example, I have to handle budgets, which is the bit I like the least. But I do find that it's really helpful if you've got someone at work that you can talk to who will go over things with you, help with that. And that's really helpful, because I've been very honest with some people I work with, and they will always be there to help, with numbers, wherever sort of budgeting, whatever comes in. Because, it's the thing where I'm good at the kind of the ideas and developing the projects and developing stuff, but when it comes to the budgets and the numbers, I'm not so good. So yeah, I mean, things like that I would say help quite a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, you're not alone. Other people have told us the same sort of things, having things visually represented rather than having just sums on a board, for example. People have also mentioned to us about supportive work colleagues and how that's really important in helping them to overcome difficulties. Oh, and what about other aspects of maths? You mentioned number work in particular. Are there some aspects of mathematics, obviously it's a broad topic, that you're good at? Things that you are not as bad at.
So I remember, actually, I used to prefer probability, actually, and I used to prefer things that. So I remember when we also started really basic algebra, I actually didn't mind that so much, because it sort of like turns almost into a game. I mean, I wouldn't say it's very advanced algebra, but it does kind of turn into a game, and I used to prefer that sort of aspect a bit more. There's certain multiplication tables I prefer to others. Twos, fives, and tens, great. 11s until you get into the hundreds. So yeah, there's aspects of that. I do find. I mean, it's interesting when you think. So I mean, sorry, this might sound like a very pretentious answer, but there's a novel by a writer called Zia Haider Rahman. And it's called In the Light of What We Know. It's not an easy book to read at all. It's very big, but in it he talks a lot about maths, and he talks about this mathematical Kurt Gödel, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and I found that really interesting to think about the fact that maths is all about certainty and like providing answers, but actually there's elements of maths that you can't know, and I find that interesting to think about. But if you ask me to move that into maths, numbers, and the kind of mechanics of maths, I probably wouldn't enjoy it.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. I haven't read that book, so maybe we can put the link in our show notes so that other listeners can find it, because that might be a useful thing to pass on.
Incidentally, I always think that, I mean, I would love one day to write a book on dyscalculia and my experience of dyscalculia, because some of the things I mentioned earlier about the kind of gendered aspect, that I think there are things to do there and things to write there. And it upsets me because, I mean, I'm a big reader. I really like reading. And I find, if you go to any bookshop, you'll see that there's loads there on ADHD, autism, XCL. There's still not really a good book on dyscalculia. And yeah, I hope one day to write it. So
Okay, well, that sounds good. We've got several articles that we're hoping to write on the back of our research. So there will be some other evidence coming out that you can draw on to write your book. Okay, so we're getting near the end of our podcast now. I'm just thinking about preparation for adult life, really. And in terms of mathematics, you talked about how some aspects were easier than others, and using a calculator is a really good thing. Are there things that maybe your school could have done to help you better prepare for adult life?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I don't also want to, do down the maths teachers I had at secondary school. I actually do think they did a good job and it really helped. But I think, and this is more on a sort of curriculum level as opposed to, maths itself. But I really think, we must have education on finance in our schools, because, so much of our approach to literacy, for example, and teaching English is about providing people with the skills to read and write and, read critically, which is extremely important right now, of course, and all of this stuff. But I don't think we are adequately providing people to manage a budget, to manage their house, to, think about things like mortgages and stuff like that. So all of that stuff, I mean, I think there just needs to be general sort of thinking about how, what maths we need in our everyday life. So I definitely would have preferred that. And I think that would have been more useful for me. And yeah, I would have liked that, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful for us to know. And is there anything else, particularly about the identification of math difficulties, that you'd like to share? Thinking about, messages for teachers in schools as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, just coming back also to something else. So just something else to add to the last question, which also to this one, is I also think that in retrospect, me going out to the special educational needs letter centre to have those maths lessons, I do think that could have probably been better managed. So taken away some of my feelings of anxiety and and all of that stuff. So I think there's elements of that I think could have been better managed. But I also think that leads on to my answer to the question you just asked, which is, I think generally we should have a situation where teachers are more aware of the fact that there will be someone with dyscalculia in their classroom. I mean, dyscalculia doesn't just affect maths, it affects science, geography, PE even sometimes. There's a lot of maths work, maths skills in exercise and things like that. And that's something as an adult that I'm often aware of. If you're going to a gym and you have to keep hold of like how many reps or whatever you're doing, really difficult when you can't hold numbers in your head. So yeah, so anyway, I think the fact that they can be more aware of the fact that there's people with dyscalculia in their classroom, I think more just, I guess, just sort of messaging around the fact that, all of us, including them, there is no such thing as a neurotypical brain. There is no such thing as, neurotypicality or whatever we say. So, everyone is neurodiverse on some level. No one brain is the same. And actually, as you get older, you realize how important that is, because whatever line of work you go into, whether it is, something like I'm doing, or whether it's even, I don't know, working in bank or something, you know, or you actually need different skill sets and different talents. So that should be something that I think should be messaged in any kind of educational place. It certainly was no part in my education, I would say.
Fascinating. I'm going to hand back to Liz to see if there's anything else that she'd like to ask you before we end today's session. Liz, is there anything that you wanted to pick up?
Well, I just want to thank, rather than ask any more questions, because I think you've been very patient with all our questions, Pete. I just wanted to thank you really, because it's just been so interesting to hear about all your experiences. And, I do hope that, teachers and workplaces can learn from listening to these stories, because they do help highlight the importance of early recognition, the need for effective teaching strategies, and there's some valuable lessons that we can learn from listening to people like you, Keith.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. And yeah, I hope, I mean, if just one person listens and it helps, then it's worth it.
I'm sure we'll get more than one listen.
We hope, fingers crossed. So we close this podcast now, and I just want to wrap up with a few reminders. So if you'd like to know more, do check out the links in our episode notes, and hopefully we'll get the link to that book Pete mentioned here as well. If you've enjoyed this episode, do check out more podcasts from the Institute of Education. Just search IOE Insights, and you should find lots of podcasts available there. And a quick favor before you go, we hate asking this, but if you are listening on Apple or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE Insights podcast a rating. Of course, we'd love 5 stars, but any stars would be brilliant. And that will help us reach more people who may be interested in hearing more about the IOE. So we'd like to thank, lots of thank yous today because it's our last podcast. So we'd like to thank the IOE and Marcoms, and particularly Jason, for facilitating these podcasts, and all our adult participants who have generously shared their lived experiences in this series. So, these podcasts wouldn't have happened without your voices. So thank you so much. We'd also like to thank the Higher Education Innovation Fund for funding our work, and the Dyscalculia Network, our partners, for making this collaborative knowledge exchange possible. So I've been Liz Herbert, and
I'm Helen Williams. Thank you very much for listening.
thanks again, Pete. So thanks for listening, everyone. Do check out our LinkedIn profiles. Pete, have you got a LinkedIn profile?
I do. And I also just wanted to add as well, just a plug, that if you do have any issues with dyscalculia, please do get in touch with the Dyscalculia Network.
Yeah, we'll share a link to the Dyscalculia Network website in our show notes. And if you want to contact us or you got any further questions, please do. So thank you. We've really enjoyed doing this.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening. Search IOE Insights for more podcasts from the IOE.